Maybe we should wait for Plinio to arrive. Mariole.
Okay, sorry, I started the transmission, so if you want to wait or just start, but I think Plinio should be arriving soon.
Okay. And I'm assuming there's time afterwards for me to answer questions. I mean, I don't plan to talk for a full hour. I was going to talk for, something less than that and then take questions. Okay.
So I think we can get started.
Okay.
So first of all, good morning, everyone. Good morning, prosodists. On behalf of the organizing committee of the second Brazilian Conference on Prosody, I give you a warm welcome and wish you all a very enriching and productive experience throughout the next 3 days. This is the second edition of the Brazilian Conference on Prosody. The first edition was hosted by the State University of Campinas, located in the state of São Paulo in 2019. We began to plan the second edition in 2020, and because of the uncertainties that came with the new coronavirus pandemic, we decided to hold this edition entirely online. Despite this difference in the mode of realization, we aim to achieve in this edition the same goals of the first edition, which consisted of including not only the activities of the School of Prosody held between 2010 and 2018, but also the activities of the Brazilian Colloquium on Speech Prosody held between 2007 and 2017. In other words, we expect the second Brazilian Prosody Conference to be a continuation of a long path endeavor of Brazilian prosody researchers, and thus to contribute with the development of this field in our country. The second Brazilian Prosody Conference, as the other events mentioned before, is being promoted by the Luso-Brazilian Association of Speech Sciences, ELIBAS, in partnership with the Brazilian Society of Speech Therapy. The theme of the second Brazilian Prosody Conference is spoken and sign language prosody and their interfaces. With this, we seek to create an opportunity for the exchange of knowledge and experiences among speech and sign researchers. Also, we aim to reach the Brazilian deaf community and encourage deaf students and researchers to join this field of research that is so fascinating in its complexity and with so many discoveries still waiting to be done. To guarantee our deaf audience access to mini courses, talks, and special sessions, we are providing Brazilian Sign Language Libras interpreting service. Our Libras interpreters are Professor Anderson Almeida da Silva from the Federal University of Delta do Parnaíba, Tiago Santos and Katie Abiakel, to whom we want to express our gratitude. The study of prosody in Brazil goes back to the 1960s with the work of Matoso Câmara on lexical accent. Later on, the study of intonation received more attention with the valuable contribution of researchers such as Professor Maria Bernadette Marques Abalri from the State University of Campinas, Professor César Reis from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and Professor João Moraes from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who, by the way, kindly accepted to be one of our speakers and who will close our conference with an unmissable talk on audiovisual prosody and the description of Portuguese. Other people that we must acknowledge and that are also participating in this conference are Professor Sandra Madureira from the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo and her work about voice quality and expressiveness of speech, and Professor Plínio Barbosa from the State University of Campinas, who has researched, among other topics, speech rhythm. In more recent years, the research group led by Professor Tommaso Raso from the Federal University of Minas Gerais has also been contributing to the description of prosodic boundaries in spontaneous speech. Of course, we cannot list all the researchers in Brazil that contribute to the field, many of whom are actually presenting their research papers in this conference. But we wanted to highlight that the efforts of this small group in a few places in Brazil multiplied into dozens of studies in subsequent years. Many master's and doctoral dissertations have since then been written all over the country under direct and or indirect supervision of these researchers, or even by their former graduate students. Today, these former students are also researchers and professors in public and private universities, and they keep on studying, teaching, and contributing to the field of prosody in Brazil. Finally, we want to mention the Profala group, which has been active since 2004. In this group, prosodists discuss topics related to speech prosody and publicize events in the area. The group access link will be shared on the chat as soon as possible. In comparison to research on Brazilian Portuguese prosody, research on Libras prosody is in its infancy. Thus far, to the best of our knowledge, there are only 3 PhD dissertations about Libras prosodic aspects. The first one was developed by Professor Tarcísio Leite in 2007. He analyzed intonation units in Libras discourse from a functional cognitive linguistics perspective. Later on, Professor Nelson Pimenta, who is deaf, carried out a comparison between Libras and American Sign Language ASL prosody. Finally, Diego de Souza conducted an investigation in 2020 of the prosodic structure of Libras, focusing on no manuals from a generative perspective. These works surely represent an important contribution to the field, but there's much more to be done so we can have a better understanding of Libras prosody. It's our desire that the mini courses and the sessions in this conference will inspire and encourage researchers to help to further develop this field in Brazil. We must also mention the Luso-Brazilian Association of Speech Sciences, LBAS, without which this conference would not exist. We would like now to invite Professor Eliana Mello to say a few words on behalf of LBAS. She's the Vice President of LBAS and is a full professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Her work in linguistics focuses on empirical research on areas of language contact, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics of spontaneous speech. She has been a key researcher in the area of corpus linguistics in Brazil, contributing with the Coral Brazil, the Lindsay Brazil, and the Calpe Corpora. Professor Eliana is also a collaborator in the Tarsila project, an artificial intelligence project on natural speech synthesis and recognition. So Welcome, Professor Eliana. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Andre. Good morning, everybody. My very warm welcome to all who are participating in this conference, the guests, and also my thank you to the organizers of the conference. Well, ELBAS is the Luso-Brazilian Association for Speech Sciences, and it was created actually by our dear colleague Plínio Barbosa, who is a great supporter of prosodic studies in Brazil. And currently, the president of the association is Professor Tommaso Raso, in whose behalf I'm speaking here. We are also joined in our team by Frederico Cavalcante and Saulo Mendes. And we've been trying to make speech sciences more popular in Brazil, in Portugal, and all Lusophone countries. And currently, we have been offering courses, mini courses, throughout the year in order to advance our knowledge in the speech sciences. And we are very thankful for our colleagues who have very graciously accepted to teach these courses. We are also compiling a glossary of terms, and we've had the contribution of many colleagues on that endeavor as well. And I'm very thankful to them. And our goal is to actually create a dictionary of speech sciences to be offered to the community. And I would then invite all of you, for those of you who are not members, to become members. Our fees are really very low. And we welcome students, professionals, anyone interested. I'm going to add the link to our site through chat, so that for those of you who haven't been able to visit our site, you are most welcome to. So having said all these words, I want to thank you all for being here. And I really wish we have a wonderful conference ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Eliana. So before we move on to the next session, I would like to invite everyone to check our schedule. Following this morning's conference, we have a special session on multimodality in sign and speech, when we'll have the participation of Professor Tarcísio Leite and Professor Aline Pizio, both from the Federal University of Santa Catarina. In the afternoon, we have the conference Similarities and Differences in the Prosodic Structure of Signed and Spoken Languages by Professor Ronnie Wilbur. Following that conference, we have the second special session with the participation of Professor Albert Hilliard from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Professor Mariane Cavalcante from the Federal University of Paraíba, and Professor Alessandro Panunzi from the University of Florence. To end the day, we have the session Prosody and L2. Tomorrow we start with the conference Harmonicity as an indestructible rhythmic structural marker of speech that will be given by Professor Volker Delvaux, and 2 sessions on prosody and pragmatics. Finally, on the last day of the conference, we'll have in the morning 2 sessions, the session Speech and Prosody and Speech Disorder and Forensics. In the afternoon, the session Acoustic Prosody. And in the closing conference, Prosódia, Audiovisual e Descrição do Português by Professor João Moraes. Now, I would like to invite Professor Plínio Barbosa to introduce our first guest speaker. Professor Plínio Barbosa is an associate professor of the Department of Linguistics of the Institute of Language Studies at the State University of Campinas and responsible for the Speech Prosody Studies Group, a team of researchers and students working on dynamical analysis and modeling of speech prosody. He has published more than 130 papers in international and national journals and conference proceedings, besides the books Incursões em torno do ritmo da fala, in 2006, and Manual de Fonética Acústica Experimental in 2015 with Professor Sandra Madureira. Besides having proposed a coupled oscillator dynamical model for dealing with the speech rhythm, he has conducted research on the description and modeling of speaking styles, Brazilian Sign Language, breathing and speech coordination, bioacoustics, and phonetics of L2. He's the editor of the Journal of Speech Sciences, a member of the editorial board of several international and national journals, and a member of several phonetics-related associations. Welcome, Professor Plínio Barbosa. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, André. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Martha Tyrone, who is assistant professor from the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Long Island University in Brooklyn. Her research deals with relationship between human movement, language, and communication in both clinical and non-clinical populations. She's attempts to understand the structure of sign language, particularly as it relates to the phonetic and phonological units from spoken languages, and also to inform the development of sign and speech-based therapies for neurogenic language deficits. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, Martha, to this second conference on prosody in Brazil, and be very feel very welcome here to talk to us about your research, and we are very happy to have this opportunity to be able to hear you talking about sign language. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Plínio, and thank you, Andre. I appreciate being invited. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about my research. And what I'm doing today will basically be an overview of several years of research, not going into an enormous amount of detail on each study, but I can answer questions about them as they come up. So let me see if I can share the screen successfully.
Yes.
Okay, so far so good. So I'm talking mostly about research on sign languages and mostly on American Sign Language, but I'll also be talking a bit about what we can learn about the relationship between prosody and modality from co-speech gesture as well. That's a more recent line of my research. So to give you some context about sign language in general and American Sign Language in particular, American Sign Language is the language of the deaf in the US and Canada. And we can trace its history back to 1817, when the American School for the Deaf was established by Thomas Gallaudet. Probably there were remnants of it prior to that, but what has often happened in sign languages is that a sign language forms when a community forms. So usually when a school develops, for example, that brings people together who are all deaf. ASL is distinct from English. It's not just a manual version of English, but it's also distinct from other sign languages. I don't know this, but my understanding is that both American Sign Language and Libras, the sign language of Brazil, are related to French Sign Language, because it was French educators who set up the educational system in the US. But ASL is quite distinct from British Sign Language. I've done research on both languages, and they are quite different from each other, especially in terms of their vocabulary. They have very different vocabularies. So for example, the ASL sign for true looks like this. Versus the British Sign Language for true, British Sign Language sign for true looks like this. So a completely different lexicon. Linguistic research on ASL goes back to about the early 1960s, where the goal of this initial research was just to show that ASL has linguistic structure and is distinct from idiosyncratic gesture and is distinct from English. So the first steps in this research was to start investigating the syntax, the phonology, the morphology of American Sign Language. Later research started looking into the acquisition process and was able to show that ASL is acquired in the same way that spoken languages are, that children go through the same stages of acquisition at about the same ages, provided they have typical exposure. And I'll come back to that point in just a minute. Once we got a bit more sophisticated with our ability to analyze brain activity and brain anatomy, there was research focusing on the idea that sign languages use the same parts of the brain as spoken languages. This despite the fact that they use two different sensory systems and very different motor structures. So let's think about how sign is different from speech. This was a lot of what motivated me in the beginning, was to try to figure out what the structural differences between sign and speech actually were and what their roots were. So perhaps the most obvious difference is that sign and speech use different articulators. Speech uses the vocal tract and the respiratory system, whereas sign languages use the hands, the arms, the body, the face, the head in coordination with each other. So one difference between the two systems might just be that they have very different motor control and very different coordination patterns. But on top of that, sign and speech have different perceptual mechanisms. And the way that whether we are hearing or deaf, whether we are blind or sighted, the way that we perceive one system versus the other relies on a different sensory modality. So the perceptual mechanism for sign languages is necessarily going to be the visual system. Speech, it turns out, relies a little bit on vision, but relies primarily on hearing. This third difference is a bit less obvious than the others. If you aren't familiar with the deaf community and if you aren't familiar with sign language research, you might not be aware of this, or you might not have thought about it. But one thing that's different about sign versus speech is that most signers are not born into signing families. Most signers don't acquire their sign language from their parents. They acquire it from their peers or from their teachers. It's kind of a standard bilingual situation where someone has one language that they use at home and then a different language that they use in the schools, at work, that kind of thing. And some of the early research on reading in the deaf showed that when you control for age of exposure to the language, that deaf readers are as skilled as hearing readers. It's just that most deaf people were previously, at least, weren't getting language exposure at a young age. The fourth difference I want to mention here is something I alluded to before, that sign languages form when enough deaf people come together in a community for a language to develop. So that means that sign languages themselves haven't been around as long as spoken languages, or at least haven't been documented as well. Maybe they had developed previously, maybe there were, communities of deaf people centuries and centuries ago, but we have no record of that. So my research focuses on the phonetics of ASL. I am less interested in the more abstract structure and more interested in the relationship between language structure and motor control. And I think that you have to analyze these things in careful detail to get at that topic. So like I was mentioning, ASL uses a visual manual channel rather than an auditory oral channel. So that means that to some extent, the structural primitives of the language are going to be a bit different, but they will have some similarities, we think, to the structural primitives of speech. We need to have meaningless elements that we can combine together that then become meaningful. We need to be able to have a way of taking individual lexical items and putting them together to form utterances, that sort of thing. By now, we know quite a bit about the physics and the physiology of speech, and about the relationship between acoustics and articulation. But we really don't know much about signing at the level of the physics and the physiology and the kinematics. That research that I was mentioning before that goes back to the 1960s initially focused on the phonological parameters of ASL. Stokes' term was phonological parameters, meaning the minimal units, minimal structural meaningless units that could differentiate one sign from another in ASL. And the three that he identified were hand shape, location, and movement. What we mean by hand shape is just how a hand is configured as a sign is being produced. Location refers to where on the body a sign is produced or makes contact. And movement refers to the trajectory of the hands during the sign. So we can come up with minimal pairs for different signs in, we can come up with minimal pairs in ASL according to these three parameters. So the sign for mother and the sign for say in ASL only differ by hand shape. And they look like this. So the only difference is how the hand is configured. An example of a contrast in location are the signs summer and dry, which look like this. So the same hand configuration and the same movement, but produced at two different locations, gives you two different signs. Two different signs that can be differentiated in ASL by movement are the signs young and animal, which look like this. So again, same hand shape, same location, but different movements. A lot of the early research on sign phonetics focused on hand shape. My research has focused mostly on the other two. And that's what I'll be talking about some more today. Later on, Robin Battison observed that signs can also be different in terms of the orientation of the hand, that this would be another way to differentiate signs from each other. This parameter doesn't seem to be as important as the other three. It occasionally differentiates some signs, but not very often. This was an early figure that tried to identify and label the distinct sign locations in American Sign Language. Stokoe, in his original research, identified what he thought were 12 contrastive locations associated with landmarks on the body. But a lot of signs are produced not on the body or in contact with the body, but in the physical space in front of the signer, which came to be known as the neutral space. I will be coming back to the idea of location in a little bit when I show you some results from a study a while ago. But one thing that I want to mention here is that location can vary quite a bit phonetically and as an effect of somebody's signing style or the context. People might reduce their production of some signs if they're signing rapidly or if they're trying to sign something secretly, or what we would think of in spoken language as quietly. So a couple of photos to show you the setup of the lab where I recorded most of this data. What we have here is a set of 6 infrared sensitive cameras, and we place reflective markers on the body of our signing participants. These are just taped on to their clothing or to their skin. And what happens is each individual camera has a set of infrared strobes. So the light is not visible to us, but is visible to the cameras. And then the light is just reflected off of the reflective markers. So this lets us track the motions of the individual markers in 3 dimensions. And we're able to collect data at a rate of 100 cycles per second. So that's plenty resolution to let us collect good signing data. The image on the right is just a 3D representation of the relationship of these different body parts to each other and how they're connected to each other. We could turn this into an avatar if we were doing something fancy and making a movie or something, but it's just for visualization purposes here. So going back to the idea of sign movement, what we don't understand very well, what hasn't been explored, at least in a lot of detail phonetically, is how sign movements are influenced by things like phrase structure or signing rate or those other things. We know in spoken language how we indicate things like beginnings and ends of phrases. We understand pretty well the relationship between pitch and timing and voice quality to show syntactic boundaries. There's been quite a bit of research showing that signers use movements of the torso and movements of the head, as well as facial expressions, to serve the same kind of purpose. What there's been less research on is the effect of prosody on the realization of sign movements, of the movements of the hands themselves as somebody is producing signs. In spoken language, we have at one level a sense of the linguistic function of prosody, what prosody is there to do, to indicate where we are in a phrase or where we are in a conversational turn, that sort of thing. We also separately have a good sense of what acoustic variables are manipulated to execute this, to effectively convey prosody. So we have pretty well-established methods, especially for looking at the acoustics, but also for looking at articulation. This isn't so much the case when we're looking at sign languages. With sign languages, we don't have as well developed an idea of prosody at a functional level, separate from its structural level, separate from how it's actually physically realized. And the methods for examining it aren't nearly so well established. For the most part, sign linguistics have focused on the function of prosodic variation rather than its physical form. And like most sign language research, this has been done almost entirely on video data without much in the way of quantitative measures. So what sign linguists have mostly observed have been changes in the non-manual aspects of signing, have been changes in the position of the head, or changes in facial expression, or which way somebody is looking, shifts in the position of the body. These are all important, both at the level of syntax and semantics, as well as in terms of broader communication, conveying things like when a conversational turn is over. So facial expression in ASL is used to mark yes, no, and WH questions. Different non-manuals are also used to emphasize one sign over the other, to indicate what's the most important element in an utterance. In the context of narratives or storytelling in particular, non-manuals are important for marking the signer's perspective, for marking, whose point of view the signer is representing, as well as marking register, reflecting whether someone is signing in a formal versus less formal context, and also reflecting the signer's affect. I think when sign linguists started talking about prosody in an ASL context, I think it was mostly thought of as there being a parallel between sign and speech, so that one set of articulators was dealing with segmental structure, in the case of speech, putting together consonants and vowels and syllables, and a separate set of articulators dealing with suprasegmentals. And I think because we had that framework from spoken language linguistics, I think it was brought over to sign linguistics, and people thought, aha, okay, the non-manuals are the prosodic suprasegmental aspect of signing, whereas what the hands are doing is equivalent to the segmental structure. In reality, I think it's more complicated than that. In reality, I think we see a lot more variation in rhythm and in movement size by looking directly at the signs themselves, rather than focusing entirely on the non-manual aspects of signing. Also, flipping this around on itself, when we look at non-manual aspects of signing, are they necessarily prosodic? Or can they serve some other kind of role in sign phonetics? What I'm showing you here is a figure from a study that I did with Claude Mock back in 2016, I believe, where he and I were looking at the coordination of the head and the hand when a signer was producing signs that were located on the head. And the sign that, or target sign in this case, was the sign father, which is located on the forehead in ASL. The light gray dotted line is the vertical movement of the hand. The solid black line is the horizontal movement of the hand. So you can see when you look at the dotted gray line, you get this big rise as the person is moving their hand up in the signing space. And when you get that highest point in the signing space is where someone is producing the sign father, because that's where the hand is the highest. That very top line, the dotted dark gray line, is the horizontal position of the head. So if you look at each realization of the sign father, as the hand comes up and moves towards the center, the head turns to the right to meet it. So it's not that the hand is executing the sign all by itself. The movement of the head facilitates the contact between the two. So head movements are operating at a purely phonetic level too. Head movements aren't just indicating something about phrasing or syntactic structure. They're also basically part of the phonetic execution of the sign. A lot of the work that I have done, both on sign language and on co-speech gesture, has borrowed some concepts and terminology from articulatory phonology, which you're probably familiar with, but in case not, articulatory phonology takes the idea that articulatory gestures are the minimal units of spoken language. And in our research, we extended that a bit to include sign languages as well. The nice thing, for me at least, about using articulatory phonology as a framework is that it lets you use the same kind of structure regardless of whether you're talking about sign or speech. If the minimal units of production and perception are articulatory gestures, then you can have articulatory gestures that use the speech articulators, or you can have those that use the sign articulators. So within this framework, actually, I think I pretty much just said what I have written on this slide. Within this framework, we took the articulatory phonology approach of thinking of signs as having three movement phases: an approach to the location, a plateau where the hand more or less stays in place, and then a release where the hand leaves the location. So we designed a set of experiments where signers were producing utterances where the target sign either had a movement towards the body or a movement away from the body. And we looked at three different sign locations: the upper head, the chin, and the torso. And we manipulated the phrase boundaries so that the target sign was either phrase initial, phrase medial, or phrase final. And we kept, while manipulating the phrase boundary, we kept the phonetic environment the same. Just so you know what you're seeing here, there's a convention, at least in American sign language research and most other sign language research that I know of, there's a convention of having glosses of the signed language content in all capital letters. So that's what we've got here, is just a gloss of the ASL utterances, and then a mark for where the phrase boundary is. Because English has relatively flexible word order, the lexical sign for not can either follow the word that it's modifying or it can precede it. So we took advantage of this in designing our stimuli. So these are examples of a sign with a movement away from the body, the sign willing, which looks like this. And the sign sick, which looks like this. And this is just a still image of those two signs with sick on the left and willing on the right. This is one of our ASL signers who is producing that phrase that I showed you before. This first set of phrases, no niece, willing not, stubborn. And so in this clip that I'm going to show you, she is producing this sequence of 3 utterances where the only thing that's manipulated is the phrase boundary. It goes pretty fast, so I'll show it a couple of times. The difference between them is pretty subtle. So what we did was we compared the marker data for the hand and for whichever marker on the body was nearest to the location. Like I said, we looked at signs that were located either on the torso, the chin, or the upper head. So we used one of those marker positions as our reference point. And then we delimited the gesture phases, whether something was a formation, a plateau, or a release, based on a cutoff point in the velocity of the hand movement. And then we looked at the durations of those different movement phases as they relate to the different phrase boundaries. What we found, this was a small data set, but what we found was that the formation phase, when someone was just moving to the sign's location, was lengthened for most signs when the phrase occurred, when the sign occurred phrased initially. The second 2 phases, the plateau and the release, had longer durations when the sign was in phrase final position, at least for 2 of the signs. One of the signs behaved a little bit differently, which we're not sure how to interpret. And then for one sign, the plateau phase, the time when the sign was at the location, was lengthened in phrase final position. Again, like I said, this is a small data set and it's a little bit complicated, but we can at least begin to conclude from this that prosody affects the realization of manual signs themselves as well as affecting non-manual aspects of signing. I'm going to switch topics a bit now and talk about some work that I've been doing with colleagues of mine at Haskins Laboratories on co-speech gesture. So just to be clear what we're talking about, the research that I was describing up to now was about established sign languages with established lexicons and grammars. Co-speech gesture is more idiosyncratic. Co-speech gesture occurs spontaneously as somebody is talking or as somebody is signing. They're not lexical. There's not a one-to-one relationship between a co-speech gesture and a word, but they are part of face-to-face communication. And we can see, both from our research and other studies, that both lexical signs in signed languages and non-lexical manual gestures can be influenced by prosodic structure. Previous research had suggested that manual gestures are related to prosodic structure and that gestures tend to be timed to prominent syllables. Sorry about that. But the nature of that relationship hasn't been very well understood. Most of the research has been done on gestures that are either for rhythm and timing, what are called beat gestures, versus gestures that point to something in the environment, a pointing gesture or deictic gesture. And it's been suggested that the gesture's movement, that its greatest movement, is what's coordinated between gesture and speech. It's also been suggested that the pitch accent peak is the target of coordination. But most of this research has been done not necessarily impressionistically, but based on video, without coordination of the different recording systems at the same time. So we wanted to expand on this and try to measure things as precisely as we could and in a comprehensive sort of way. So what we were asking in this set of studies was what particular speech gesture is the pointing gesture coordinated with when we have a sequence of consonants and vowels and we place it so that we manipulate stress and phrase position. Is the pointing gesture coordinated with the consonant, with the vowel, or with the tone gesture? And are these coordinated in terms of the onset of those gestures or the targets of the gestures? So we have looked at 2 speakers. This is a pilot study. And we asked the speakers to produce one of 2 nonsense words. We presented them as names in the context of a few different sentences. We manipulated, in the nonsense word, we manipulated whether stress was on the first or the second syllable. And we manipulated whether the target word was in the middle of the utterance, whether it was at a minor intonational phrase boundary, such as in a list, or at a major phrase boundary, major intonational phrase boundary, such as a clause boundary. And our two speakers produced 72 and 90 sentences each. So the way that we did this, we asked the speaker to gesture as they were producing the utterance. They weren't gesturing spontaneously, they were gesturing based on our instruction. And we presented them with an image. So we had two dolls, images of two dolls that were named Mima and Mima. And so the speaker would have to point at one versus the other, and produce the phrase that we gave them. Produce the utterance that was written. So in these first three, in each case, the stress is on the first syllable. In the last three, the stress is on the second syllable. In the first case, the target word is in the middle of a phrase. In the second case, the target word is at a minor intonational boundary. And in the third case, the target word is at a major intonational boundary. So this is where, no, this is not yet my fun slide, but I'm almost there. This is just showing you the setup of how our speaker was positioned. So this is our participant sitting near an electromagnetic articulometry system. Her interlocutor is just across from her. We simultaneously recorded audio. We recorded vocal tract movements using this EMA system. And we used the Vicon system that I showed you before to record manual gestures. And these three systems were all connected to each other so that they were time synced with each other, as well as using the same spatial coordinates as each other. And so the speaker would have to point at what she was seeing on this screen where the images were presented. This is what it looks like in terms of the equipment setup. So the EMA sensors were attached with glue to the speech articulators. And then the Vicon markers are attached to skin and clothing. Same idea as before, but with slightly different marker placement and a slightly different positioning of the cameras. Now, here is the fancy slide that I was referring to before, where we can see in this one production the realization of Mima. We have the audio up top. Just below that, the pitch contour. Below that, the position of the tongue dorsum. Below that, the lip aperture. And then finally, the up-down position of the finger, which is what we were measuring from. And if you look, the maximum displacement of the finger lines up pretty well with this pitch peak. I think I will leave that for there, and I can leave that for now, and I can answer questions if anyone has them. But basically what we found is that the pointing gesture was coordinated to the tone gesture, specifically in terms of a target-to-target coordination, which is consistent with what we predicted and consistent with what past research had shown based on more qualitative analyses. Now, obviously, these results are pretty preliminary because we were dealing with a small sample size, and despite that, there was still a good bit of variability across those participants. So to sum things up, non-manual head and body movements are one channel for representing prosody in the sign modality, but they're not the only way that sign languages represent prosody. Prosody is reflected in how the movements executed by the hands during signing. That's also influenced by prosodic structure. And like we expected, there is a timing relationship between co-speech gestures and prosodic peaks, which is consistent with what past research had shown. But again, we were looking at it in quite a bit more detail. Also, the very early research on co-speech gesture was suggesting that co-speech gestures occurred primarily during pauses, not during continuous speech. So it's a little bit surprising that if co-speech gesture were occurring primarily between utterances, that you would have any kind of timing relationship at all between prosody and co-speech gesture. In terms of where to go from here, I think we would benefit a lot from more careful analyses of corpus data. I think it's one way to help with our numbers problem in terms of analyzing sign phonetics. It's difficult to do a large sign phonetics study just because the amount of data analysis involved is intimidating. Also, I have been talking pretty much entirely about American Sign Language, which is what the language that most sign linguistics has investigated. We need quite a bit more cross-linguistic sign data so that we can be sure that what we're saying isn't specific to ASL. We can bring together the idea of sign prosody and gesture prosody by looking at bimodal bilinguals. What I mean by that are people who are fluent in both language modalities, people who are usually hearing children of deaf adults who were exposed to both modalities at a very young age and use them equally fluently. And if we have, especially if we look at that population, we can do more systematic comparisons of hand and arm movement in sign versus gesture. And I believe that is it. So thank you so much for your attention, and I am happy to answer questions. I will go ahead and turn off the share, and if somebody has a question that refers back to the talk, I can go back to it.
Thank you so much, Martha,
Sure.
for this stimulating talk. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions, please. You can put it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Martha, for this wonderful and so delightful presentation. I enjoyed it very much. You mentioned a study that shows that the head moves during the production of signs. Mm-hmm. And we know that the head is phonologically considered to be a passive articulator.
Right.
And I would like to hear from you if you think that those results have implications for that phonological treatment. I'm mentioning that because I've noticed, although I haven't used Vicon yet, that the passive hand behaves in a similar fashion. So when we analyze the production of signs that have a passive hand, usually the passive hand is not completely stationary. It moves somehow. Right? So anyway, I'd like to hear you about that. Thank you so much again.
Sure. I will do what I can. I honestly tend to avoid phonology. So in terms of claims about the head being active versus passive, putting aside theory, I think that most of the realization of signs is in what the hands and arms are doing. But I think the head, and like you mentioned, the non-dominant hand, or for that matter, other parts of the body, probably also act to facilitate contact between the hand and that location. I mean, that's what we see with the head, just based on this phonetic data. And we weren't going, that wasn't our research question when we did that study. In that study, we were just looking at phonetic reduction as an effect of phonetic environment and signing rate. But then this movement of the head kind of jumped out at us in the data. So I would say that these smaller, more subtle movements are there, and that they are there to facilitate the realization of the sign. I'm a bit at a loss for the implications for theory, because I don't tend to ask that kind of question. So sorry to disappoint on that. And yes, Plinio, you had a question?
Yes, two short questions, or probably comments or suggestions. It's related to your final slide on with the data on speech and gestures. I think I know it's just a simple example, but I checked that the tongue dorsum valley also seems to be close to the finger target. Maybe it could be important to take a look at other possible landmarks, in my opinion.
We actually did.
Yes.
We did a comparison of the gesture onset and the gesture target for the F0 peak, for the tongue dorsum movement, and for the lip movement. And the one that it corresponded to most closely and most consistently was the F0 peak.
Great. And do you think that research on other languages, because of differences in the use of acoustic parameters for syllabic prominence and phrasing, for instance, Brazilian Portuguese with much more duration than F0, this could be a nice thing to investigate it as well, to confirm if this is really F0, or in some languages that use more duration could be tongue dorsum, for instance. I don't know.
Right. No, it could. I mean, it could well be. I mean, the tongue dorsum in this case, as you probably noticed, what the tongue dorsum was indicating was mostly the production of the vowel, and the lip aperture was indicating where the bilabial closure occurred for the consonant.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's entirely possible, because we have only looked at a small number of speakers and only for English.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible that what we're seeing is language specific.
Mm-hmm.
The big innovation of this was putting together this method of data collection.
And just a very short one is that do you think about using participants that normally use a lot of the hands to talk, instead of force them to point to some picture like this? More spontaneous use of the hand. How do you think it's complicated?
It is complicated. We've talked about that quite a bit. This is research that I'm doing with Mark Titi and Jelena Krivokapic. And we have talked about different ideas. We talked about looking at spontaneous gesture, and it's so difficult to control, and you get an enormous amount of data that is very messy. So we talked about that. We decided to start instead with giving people directions to gesture, looking just at the simple pointing gestures as a way to get started. But definitely, I agree that following up with spontaneous gesture would be a good direction to go in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I think you have another question or a comment by Leticia in the chat.
Let's see, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure, that's fine. No, I'm familiar with that work, and it makes sense that this was something I had observed just informally myself, that the head moves more, and frankly, I think that's just because it can. The head moves more during signing than the torso does. That said, I believe with what Puponen was doing, and certainly with what we were doing, the signer was seated. So it's not clear if the torso would move more if it weren't supporting someone's weight. But honestly, I think the head just moves more because it's smaller and can move around more easily. Okay, so yeah, they were also looking at seated signers. All right.
Thank you. Other questions? Probably a short one. No? No more questions? Okay, if you don't have any more questions, it's my pleasure to thank you again, Martha, to be here now with us, and thank you for these stimulating issues that you raised for us. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful time there.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. It was nice to have this fun thing to do. And, I wouldn't be giving a talk at a small conference in Brazil if we weren't doing this all remotely. So I appreciate your flexibility in terms of setting up the format this way. No, this was great fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of us. Thank you, all the public and the organizers for this wonderful talk. Have a wonderful continuity with the program of the conference. Thank you. Have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
So thanks again, Martha. And we'll have a short break now before the next section starts.
Okay, great. All right, thanks.
I'll be back. We'll be back at 11.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Plinio. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Maria, everybody. And thank you, Anderson, as well, for the interpretation.